16, we'll call the meeting to order. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Is meeting being televised?
Frank, are we being televised?
We are.
Okay, this meeting is being televised for the people at home. All right, Chairman's report is just going to be a quick overview of how I'd like to see things happen this evening. Members of the committee were provided what basically is a rough draft / working document, may see some changes from Mr. Madden. The plan is by Thursday, Mr. Madden will have a complete document for us to work off of. He'll provide that to us on Thursday, and I will make sure by Thursday evening it's out to everyone. The plan will be, we're going to have Mr. Madden present entirely right through. If you have questions, just write them down. We'll do a Q&A and a budget discussion after his presentation. The plan as of right now is this evening, quick Q&A, as long as it will take Q&A. Then we will review his document, and hopefully we can meet again before the special town meeting to kind of have a wrap-up with Mr. Madden at that point. And that should give everyone enough time to look at the finalized document. Next thing on the agenda will be the Mars report, and we are going to have Don Byers go over that. I believe everyone has a copy in their packet. Take it away.
Thank you. So the Mars report is generated from the Mass Association of Regional Schools. It is a service provided to give towns, to give the school committee a perspective on each of their member towns. So it is a member town financial report. The Whitman-Hanson School Committee received a report for Hanson and for Whitman. I'll just touch on a few things. Or just to give you a summary at first, it's a complete financial picture of the member town. So some of these things Mr. Madden is going to touch on in his report as well, but it gives, demographics of the town and the tax rate, the free cash stabilization funds. As far as Whitman is concerned, the stabilization fund is, I call it a safety net. It's currently the balance is 8% of the general appropriation. Seems like a healthy balance. The report also gives information on the excess levy capacity. You can find that on page 10. Just to go briefly, the explanation on page 10, it says excess levy capacity. The gap between the amount taxed and the amount allowed to be taxed by Proposition 2.5 is referred as the excess levy capacity. Recently, Whitman has, for FY20, it's been reported the excess levy capacity is about $3,000. So that's looking in good shape compared to previous years. Also on the financial picture in the report, talks about income, property values of the town, municipal budget trends by department, and education as a percent of the town's budget, so the amount of education spent. Just want to touch on that. That's on page 17 at the top. So it references historically for the budget of Whitman, education has typically remained around 44 to 46% of the total general budget. The state average is 47%. I have seen the Hanson report. It is around the same, 44% of their town budget. In regards to information in this report on the school district. It talks about the minimum local contribution, the trends. I'd just like to highlight on page 21, it says target share trends. So the state gives you a minimum local contribution, and then they establish a target where they want your minimum local contribution to be at. So at the top of page 21, you can see, looking at FY20, the actual share in the bottom right corner is 44%. This target they want you to be at is 46%. So while we're striving to reach that target, the minimum local contribution will continue to go up annually. I think the last thing I want to touch on is enrollment. Towards the back of the report, it does give a really nice enrollment picture for by school and for the district as a whole. It reports the, sorry, I don't have a specific page, but I have notes. Overall, the 10-year enrollment has declined in Whitman 5%. Just to give some perspective around that, it's 165 students over the 10 years. Whitman's declining enrollment is 21%, and that's 408 students. Specifically in the last 5 years, the report shows at Conley School, the declining enrollment over the last 5 years is only 20 students. So their enrollment has really stayed steady. Whitman Middle Schools remain flat. I think it's about a change of 2 students over the past 5 years. And Duval has lost or declined about 90 students. That's in the last 5 years. So I think enrollment-wise for the town of Whitman, my observation is it's remaining fairly steady. It's decreased a little bit, but if you consider over 10 years, 165 students, maybe 16 students a year, you're maybe losing 1 student in a grade. You can't reduce a teacher if you've lost 1 student. You can't really reduce any services or spending. So that's just my observation. One other word that comes up in the report references the budget is hold harmless, and it just has to do with Chapter 78 also. I don't want to get in too deep because there's a lot to that. But hold harmless refers to the amount of aid that we get currently, which the district receives $24,776,700. When the state calculates our foundation budget, they look at that aid as $4 million more than our current foundation budget. And there's a Student Opportunity Act out there in legislation. You may have heard a lot about it. There's a lot of towns that are going to get a lot of funds infused to them because of low-income English language learners, gateway cities. I don't know that that's going to enhance any state aid funding here in Whitman. But I will say out of the 86 regional school districts, that figure of $24 million, we are in the top 5 out of 86 schools. Comparatively, Silver Lake Regional School District receives $8 million, $8,200,000. I'm just trying to give a little perspective on our state aid as a school district, what we receive. Sure, at Whitman-Hanson we have about 3,800 students. Silver Lake has 1,700 students, so there's a difference. But and of those 4 other towns that receive more state aid than Whitman-Hanson as a regional school district, those 4 towns get between $26 million and $28 million. So our $24 million is pretty high up there. I think we're very fortunate to be getting that much state aid. Those 4 regional school districts are Wachusett, Greater Lowell, Greater Lawrence, and Greater New Bedford. And then we're 5th right behind them. That would be.
Can I just add one thing? The last page, on page 25, you just want to look at school choice, because school choice is a conversation starter. Sometimes people are a little confused that what school choice is. School choice is voted by the committee every year for us to allow a certain amount of students per grade level or per school into our school system. The school committee does not vote to say kids can't leave. Kids can leave in our regional district anytime they want in choice out. Local schools around us that have school choice are Abington, East Bridgewater, Bridgewater Raynham, West Bridgewater, and I think those are the local communities. I brought school choice in to the high school in 14 into 15, strictly looking at bringing in some revenues for the communities and trying to offset any type of school choice going in or going out. It's something we need to look at as a school committee moving forward to see if, with our declining enrollment, especially in the town of Hanson, whether we can bring in school choice in the elementary level and the middle level to balance off, again, some of the regional school districts' revenue issues that we have. As you see on the page, we have 53 kids in now at choice. We're losing 24, or we lost 24 this year. The big key for this committee here, we're losing kids in kindergarten to choice, to school systems that are choice and offer full-day K, and those students don't tend to come back. This doesn't include charter schools as far as the Mars document. I don't have those figures in front of me, but we are losing students, as we talked about, an override in capacity in the regional district. As far as full-day K, we are starting to see choice numbers up, which is it's not revenue, it's money going out the door, and those students are coming back. So it's just, I wanted to highlight that page. We've been okay, and this is strictly high school only. So when you bring in choice revenues, they have to be apportioned to the building where those students are for personnel and for product, for educational materials. They don't go to insurance, they don't go to debt, they don't go to anything transportation. It has to be for student use only.
I have a question for you on that. It's costing us about $6,000 to send school kids out, but we're only getting about 55, 75 in. How does that work? Does each school have a different rate?
So it's a different rate. The minimum you can get is actually it's set by your per pupil expenditure. Since we're 7 from the bottom, we have a lower number. This also doesn't include, choice numbers can go up if the student's on an education on an IEP. So those numbers can be up. A school can receive, one of our students, we receive close to $13,000 for that student. Most of our students that we come in, we get $5,000 for.
And I want to follow up on school choice, especially at the high school. I support that because a lot of the students, and Jeff, you can speak to specifics, but a lot of them are the result of one of their parents moving to another town, and that they have chosen to stay in their high school. Maybe it was freshman or sophomore year. So those are the situations that school choice really is important for.
And we count those students that are already present. So it's like I count it found revenue. They choose our school, and we've accounted for those already in class sizes. So, and that's why we might look at broadening that opportunity for our students in the future.
The report actually has some charter school numbers on page 18. It's hidden in the middle of the graph, but at the top, it references Whitman students and where they attend school. So in 2010, there were 12 charter school students, and it goes up to FY18, 25 charter school. So there's been a slow climb.
That's K through 12. That's the charter. Or is that just?
I would imagine so. Right, that's total kids K through 12. Okay.
Question, what does our district public represent?
Out of district public, would that be choice going up?
I'm looking, I don't know what page is that on.
Page 18, right next to charter. Out of district public, I would think is school choice going out.
I would think so, yes.
Yeah, everything else seems to be covered.
Because it's just an account for the students, not necessarily if their choice or not.
Good.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Frank, did you want to, since we were talking about minimum local contribution, is it just an FYI? or-
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, a few of us attended a seminar in Needham on Chapter 70. It was interesting. It would have been better if we got there at the beginning because we didn't start over. And driving to Needham was an adventure and travel. But one of the things that I asked that Mark provided for us was a report outlining the numbers that go into calculating our Chapter 70 money. It starts with the Whitman Hanson Region FY20 net school spending numbers, and then provides a breakdown of how we arrive at those numbers. I would not attempt to cover this tonight in our meeting, but it's something you can look at and digest. I have both Whitman's and Hanson's here for comparative purposes. And I've read it twice and I'm still trying to get a good feel for it. But it's for informational purposes for the committee.
All right, so for our December 2nd meeting, if anyone has some other questions, I know you went as well, Ken, right?
Yep.
So if there's any major questions that come up on that, we'll address those on the 2nd, either Ken or Frank are here present. All right. We'll move on to Mr. Madden. Like I said, we're going to let him get through the whole presentation. If you have questions, please write them down. We'll do the questions at the end.
Okay, I want to thank you all for having me back again. A lot has gone on since the last time I was here. I've met with a number of department heads, and I have to say that the sincerity and the dedication of those department heads is there. I thought that the discussions went very well, and I think that there is an understanding of the current situation that the town of Whitman is in, and some of the steps that may be needed to work us through this. So my charge for the town of Whitman was to review and identify financial trends over the last 5 years, analyze various documents and official statements submitted to the Department of Revenue, meet with with this committee and department heads, and project forward 5 years of budgets based on trends and recommendations, and consider the possibility of an override in the future. Revenues for the town of Whitman excuse me, are fairly stagnant. State aid, local receipts, tax levy, your three major sources of revenue really haven't varied much. Over the last 5 years, state aid has increased 2.9%. Annual assessments, one of the things when you look at state aid is everybody looks at what they call the cherry sheet, all the money coming in. But the fact of the matter is, they also assess towns for various services that they provide. Generally, there's a county tax on there, there's mosquito control projects, there's public transportation. So it's great that we focus on the revenue that the state provides, but it does come at a cost. It's not a gross number, it's net of assessments that the county and the state hit up the town for. Local receipts, this last year, year over year, FY18 to FY19, 2 full years of collections. Increases and decreases were somewhat all over the place. There were small dollars, but it could be 111% down, 56% up. But ultimately, as you can see, consistent with the annual 5 years, it's been about 3.6% annually, almost 3.7% annually. What's of concern is the budget to actual ratio. The monies used to calculate the FY20 budget were 97% of the prior full year's annual collections. That's tight. That's extremely tight. Normally, what I would encourage, and I think you should consider, is about 85%. At 97% of the prior year actuals, that doesn't leave much room for anomalies. You're not talking about a lot of local receipts to begin with. So anything, a dip in permits, even a turnover sheet from the treasurer collector, the money doesn't hit the town's books in the current fiscal year. The DOR is not interested in that. The fact is that they're looking, and you just haven't given yourself much room for error. Tax levy. As you all know, the tax levy is constrained by the requirements of Proposition 2.5. And that's a calculated number. It is what it is. The number that fluctuates and that you can look at is new growth. And new growth for FY20 was $95,000 less than new growth for FY 2019. And new growth for FY20 was more than $42,000 below the 3-year average. It might well be worth looking at that and see the process. I know that the valuation process is outsourced to a company that's widely used throughout the Commonwealth, Patriot Properties. But that's something, comments I've heard at other meetings is that we see growth all over town. Where is it on our books? As an aside, it could be worth looking into. Then you have your other financing sources. You have three areas that you hit pretty hard and you use consistently year after year, and those are the ambulance receipts, receipt reserved for appropriation, motor vehicle fines, receipt reserved for appropriation, and of course free cash. Ambulance receipts, it was established at town meeting in 1981. In 2019, nearly $950,000 was collected. And the purpose of the article and the purpose of the fund is used to offset fire department operating expenses and capital. One of the items, looking at the documents, was the article itself does not call for the balance being carried forward year after year. It's closed out to the general fund each year, according to the article. That's a practice that's not being exercised here. The motor vehicle fines was established in June of 1990, and it's been basically steadily declining, but in 2019, $34,287 was collected. It's been used in the last 5 years that I examined to fund police department capital. Again, the article language requires that the funds be used to offset police operating expenses. And there's nowhere in the last 5 years that I can see where we've been compliant with that requirement. Free cash. You've probably heard the saying, it's not free and it's not cash. It's really an accident of budgeting. It just is. You collected more revenue than you anticipated, or you spent less money than you budgeted. There's a couple of other items that go in there, but they're really small compared to those two items that really make up the bulk of free cash. Free cash, again, is an accident of budgeting. It can rise, it can fall. It's not something that you should necessarily count on a consistent year-after-year basis. And having said that, it's best utilized to fund one-time expenditures. It's an ideal mate for your capital plan. It's not recommended that you use it for your operating budget because your salaries, your utilities, the like, they go on forever. Free cash fluctuates, and at times when you use free cash to fund an ongoing expense, and you don't have that much free cash in the subsequent year, how do you fill that hole? And most likely that hole is, through inflation, is worse than it was when you used free cash to fill it originally. The town, out of need, has utilized free cash to balance the budget in four of the last 5 years, 3 times to fund the debt program, and 1 time was to balance the school assessment. It's just, it's not recommended. It's just another indication of how close you are with revenues versus expenditures. Yep, got that. Going the wrong way, sorry. The operating budget. Again, I met with several department heads, and there are many holes in some of the departmental operations that you have within the town. You have a couple of single department heads. The good news is the town manager is the backup for one of the department heads. Why that is, I don't know, but it is. But that's a problem. That's a problem when you have one person in charge of, for example, IT, or one person in charge of inspectional services. They have a right to vacations. They have the bad luck to be sick, and they either take their laptops with them, or they call Frank. So what it comes down to is the annual increases over the last 5 years have been 4.86%. Now, there is good news. The increase for 20 over 19 was about 3%, which is good news. You're getting into the area where you probably have sustainable growth. But when it comes down to it, it comes down to discipline. Excuse me, it's part of the budgetary process. You come in and you tell the committees and the town, the town management what you want, and they can tell you what you can have. It pretty much comes down to that. And that's what really has to be looked at more closely than I think it has in the past based on the budget increases. There just needs to be tightening of the belts. And then the capital budget. It wasn't part of my charge to really look at the capital budget, but in many ways it's associated. And one of the items is that a lot of the capital budget is relying on leasing. And that's just borrowing money, but not through the debt process. It's one of those, it's an indication that you don't have the money to buy it, so you get it on credit. Somewhat of a discouraging practice. It's what you teach your kids. If you have no money, you can't have it. And leasing is a way of circumventing that. There are areas, there have been some articles that would be considered capital that have been funded through the tax levy. And finally, there are some items in the capital plan that really are better suited to the operating budget. I believe we discussed it. It's in the report. It may be here too. Understand that this is a Cliff Notes reflection of the report, and so that there's more in the report. But for example, you have patrol cars and a couple of other items, tasers, that even though it's a big piece of equipment, it's replacement equipment. You replace it every year. It really doesn't suit itself to capital. It's really more of an operating item. And going forward, I think it's important that when developing a capital plan, that you look for those things. You look for those things that you're funding in the capital plan, which is generally subject to revenue availability, rather than in the operating budget where you have more of a sense that it will be funded. So that's important to consider. think I skipped a page here. So, some recommendations. Local receipts. At the next, I would recommend that at the next town meeting, dissolve and/or modify the ambulance receipts reserve fund. I don't know what the rationale was back in when the article was adopted at town meeting, but $950,000 in local receipts go a long way to balancing your levy. You're balancing your budget, rather. At this point, you're starved for revenue. And by directing $950,000 to one particular area, you're not really in a level playing field. Now, having said that, I believe that there is a place in town for an ambulance receipts reserved for appropriation fund. Ambulances need to be replaced about every 3 years. Firefighter turnout gear, about the most important thing you can have besides water to be a firefighter. You can't scrimp on, you want them to be protected when they run into those burning buildings. So in conversations with the fire chief, we talked about, every 3 years, an ambulance, every 3 years, a set of turnout gear. Something like that, something that's specific, lends itself to a special revenue fund. When you become generic over time, the purpose for which the fund was created becomes lost. So I think I would dissolve the article in the current form, make the purpose specific, and also allow that the balance in the fund roll forward. If an ambulance is $450,000, put $150,000 of ambulance receipts. Take the first $150,000 of the ambulance receipts, put it in that fund in anticipation of purchase of the ambulance. Under the current article, if you put $150,000 in 1 year, at the end of the year, you have to close it out to the general fund. So it really, under the current language of the article, it makes no sense. At the next town meeting, I would recommend dissolving the motor vehicle fines receipts reserved for appropriation. It's not being used for the terms of the article. It is on a steady downslope. And when it is used to fund capital items, it seems to be subsidized by tax levy also. It's just there's not enough money there to cover even the capital needs of the smaller capital needs of the police department. And the sewer and water enterprise has indirect costs rather, and they are raised in the water and sewer enterprise fund and transferred to the general fund to provide for services performed and appropriated for in the general fund on behalf of the enterprise fund. An example would be collections and time spent by the treasurer collector collecting and accounting for the revenue from the users and anything else that comes in related to the enterprise fund. Currently, the current practice has been that the money is raised in the enterprise fund. It's not utilized in calculating the balancing of the general fund, but it does get transferred in. The obligation is paid to the general fund for the indirect costs. Now, the upside is because of that process, it becomes free cash. So if $500,000 is raised but not utilized to balance the budget, it's part of that calculated accident of budgeting. You collected more than you anticipated that you would. So it goes to free cash, and that's not a bad thing. However, what we're looking for is making the operating budget work. And for that, you need renewable and ongoing revenue. And my recommendation would be that you use these funds to offset the cost of your Article 2. It's currently the method that you use right now for ambulance receipts. But you would take this water indirect cost revenue and use it to offset the costs of your operating budget. What that does is it frees up that amount of levy to be used elsewhere within the operating budget. That would be a major recommendation of mine. Free cash, as a financial policy, refrain from using free cash to fund ongoing expenses. Keep it out of the operating budget. We can look, as results of this report, at some potential policies. And one I would recommend would be to mandate that free cash be utilized as a method of funding the town's capital improvement program, not paying for utilities or salaries or anything of that. The operating budget. As a financial policy, every effort should be made to fund the operating budget with renewable revenues. That's basically a continuation of don't use one-time revenues for ongoing expenses. I'd also recommend that you move the debt service budget into the town's operating budget, Article 2, thereby consolidating all of your continuing expenditures. So you have Article 2 that covers the operating budget, and then you have anything from Article 5 to Article 8 that identifies the school budget and the police department, fire department, the other bonds that have been done, your Title V bond that is out there. They're in various places throughout the warrant. I would recommend that you consolidate them all within your operating budget because they are clearly ongoing expenses. For capital budget, again, I couldn't help myself. I looked through the capital plan, and I did notice that, and we talked about this earlier, the Collins Center recommends through capital funding the police department vehicle replacement and taser replacement programs. As two examples. If you're replacing them every year, they're not really capital. They're replacement of equipment, just like you would replace yellow line paper, toner. It's equipment, big equipment, but it's equipment. And if you're replacing them every year, it really is an operating budget. Unfortunately, after I just told you to stop using the lease program, a patrol car runs about $50,000, and they replace 2 to 3 a year. The budget simply can't support that. So the lease payments, I would still put in the operating budget in the police department and general expenses. But again, you're at a point right now where the purchasing of these vehicles just can't be done on a pay-as-you-go. They're going to have to be leased. End of slideshow. Click to exit. Again, the reason that the final hasn't been released is that, I feel like I've been over these numbers, that I've been over these possibilities again and again and again and again. And somebody's going to look at it and say, well, what about? And if they have some validity, I think they belong in the report. And so that's why we're holding off distributing the final until we get to hear some of the comments in this forum. So any questions? No? Good. Okay.
Sorry. Let's let the chief go first.
No, don't apologize. Yet.
Okay, so I can start this one.
Either one of you. Have at it.
John and I have met like 2 different times and we spoke and we talked about things. On the outset of things, I understand what he's saying 110%. I can wear 2 hats and look at the big picture. But for 11 years as fire chief, I've been telling the finance committee and the board of selectmen every year that the ambulance revenue account is not a guaranteed account. You want to move $900 and some odd thousand, which $450, almost $500,000 of that yearly goes into fire department salaries already, or like operational costs. you want to take the whole thing and put it inside the levy limit to basically increase the levy is how I understand it.
Well, not all of it. Remember, we had talked about reserving for purchase of the ambulance and the turnout gear.
Right? So that's not guaranteed monies. That can go away tomorrow. Since 2010, the fire chiefs and the MMA have been battling the insurance companies every year with legislation because the major insurance companies want to limit what we can charge. And calculations that we just did 3 years ago showed if the major insurance companies got what they wanted in the legislation, it was going to cut that account by over $450,000 and decimate what we do for capital stuff. Currently, we have legislation filed. When I say we, the Fire Chiefs Association has legislation filed to lock in what we can lock in for billing rates, which is a sustainable thing. It's gotten zero traction at the State House because, as you know, the current Democratic administration is higher in health care. That's where they came from, and they're not going to lock anything on. As of August, it's hit the congressional level. In Washington, D.C., politics is now looking at emergency services, ambulance billing, ER billing, stuff to that effect, and they want to benchmark it. And just like the Commonwealth of Massachusetts major insurance companies, they want to roll us back basically to Medicare or Medicaid rates, which would cut us even more. It's be a very dangerous move to take the ambulance revenue monies and put it into the general operating budget to have Congress pass something or have the Commonwealth pass something in a year from now, and that money's gone in January. I get what you're saying. It's a dangerous road to go down, and I've had this discussion with the Board of Selectmen and the FinCom every year that account does what it needs to do. It maintains things, but someday that account might be gone, and that day is coming closer and closer. We believe, as the experts in that field, that deal with this on a regular basis and deal with the insurance companies. We already have insurance companies right now. If Scotland and BOEC gets transported and you have a specific insurance company, I'm not going to get the check. He's going to get the check, and it's up to him to give it to me. You know how well that's going? It isn't. So I get it, but you know, John does great work, and I think he did on my tremendous work. But I think our budget problem is a lot deeper than that in this town. This town, just like every other town in the Commonwealth, in 2007 and 2008, took a huge hit. The budget crashed, the market crashed, and we sustained ourselves, and we maintained our services. And you go to any department in the town of Whitman right now, and they're working in 2008 budgets, how they operate. They may have increased a bit, but they're still doing what they were doing in 2008 with the same amount of people, except me because I passed an override. But nothing has expanded. Nothing has grown in this town. The police department, the DPW. But we still have a part-time building commissioner, and this town should have two. And by moving this money in my opinion, if it goes away next year or goes away the year after, you're looking at $1 million hit, and where are you going to come up with that money?
Chief, I have a question for you. So if what you said happens, does it really matter where the money is? If it's set up the way it is now, or if it's set up the way that he's talking about, it's still going to be the same hit. It's not going to be any different, is it? I mean, it's how would it be different if we get hit and it's set up the way that it's still set up now versus the way that Mr. Madden wants to set it?
Because right now, I think it would be more manageable for the community and for the town and for people to deal with. So if we're giving $300,000 a year to salaries and everything else goes to this account or that account or say like capital stuff, and if we adopt the theory to pay cash for things, and we're banking up that account because we need to buy a $350,000 fire truck or an ambulance or new defibrillators or new radios or anything that account pays for, because that account has maintained all of the capital equipment since its inception, which is millions of dollars that this town has not had to allocate that keeps that department operating. You may only have to come up with $300,000 that that year it hits versus finding $1 million somewhere. If we're supposed to buy an ambulance that year and there's $300,000 like set aside or $160,000 like set aside, and then there's extra monies like set aside for X, Y, and Z, but only 300 of it goes to salaries, something could possibly be done to shield those other lines, and the town would only have to come up with, say, $300,000 or $350,000 to uncover like those salaries. Or that money may just cover those salaries. But as it stands right now, you take all that money and you put it in, and that goes away, you gotta come up with that money.
Tim and I had talked about this at some length. We had a couple of meetings, and I do agree with everything he says. I just feel it, again, a pumping engine or something that costs more than is collected and remains that year, under the current language of the article, has to close out. That's what the article says. The community's been bringing it forward year after year, and the balance has been building up. To the point about where it is, if it goes away, I think this year the ambulance fund subsidized the operating budget to about $500,000 for salaries and expenses. Whether it goes away in the receipts reserved for appropriation account or it goes away in the estimated receipts in the general fund, that's a $500,000 hole in your operating budget. You're going to have to cover one way or another. I think overall the fund lends itself more to capital. I just think that in a community that is really starved for revenue, ongoing revenue, that we need to level that playing field. The police department, the DPW, name a department, they need their capital items too, but there's no money there. That's the recommendation, whether or not it's expanded. I think at the very least you got to consider what the original article said and reconsider that. And again, be more specific on, my recommendation would be more specific on what the fund is used for.
And that's one part that we didn't realize either until we looked up the entire, or the specifics on the article, that did not carry over. Because if you look at the town of Hanson, the town of Bridgewater, they're pretty much have a stable budget, and they have the type of ambulance revenue account that they can build on. So the town of Hanson right now has over $1 million. The town of East Bridgewater has over $1 million. But when they go to buy that $1 million ladder truck, they've got the money and they get the cash to do it.
So what happens to the money then? If it's not, does it go back to free cash or what?
Right now, it carries through. So, in the account.
So it just,
It sits there. Yeah.
So what do you, this is where the question I had, what are you recommending that's different than what's happening now?
Let me address that. The current use of the ambulance account provides for present and future needs. They're allocated, they're identified. Under this system that Mr. Madden has suggested, we would still identify and reserve for appropriation funds for anticipated purchases. The difference is what we don't reserve for a specific purpose then comes up for grabs for basically any capital need, whether it be DPW, Council on Aging, Town Hall. Over the years, the fund has provided us with a way to segregate money for anticipated needs. In fact, if, Tim, you remember, if we go back about 16, 17 years, we used to create a reserve for appropriation purchase account and transfer money from the reserve for appropriation ambulance to the reserve for appropriation purchase.
So if I'm understanding correctly, right now, all the money in the account for the year gets spent one way or another, pretty much.
Most of it. The
is what generally happens, right?
Between capital
At the
or-
end of the year, if money needs to go elsewhere, then money from that account will get moved into salaries, which frees up money to go into different.
Ken, do you know how much money we carried over?
The end of FY19 was about 230,000.
So what's happened, it was kind of a surprise looking at the language in the warrant, because it was specific.
Hey, you asked me to come here.
It said that the money from receipts would be reserved for appropriation. Didn't necessarily say for fire, just said reserve for appropriation. And whatever money remained in the fund at the end of the year would be closed to the general fund. We haven't done that. There was not a clear understanding of what that process was. And I'm not even suggesting now that we do it unless a decision is made to change the way we reserve that money in the ambulance fund. We can identify over a 5 to 8 year period purchases that are going to utilize a good portion of that revenue. We buy an ambulance today, what are we up to, 200 on an ambulance?
300,
I mean, police car, $60,000 to purchase and equip a police car.
So what happens to that 200 and whatever thousand at the end?
It's available for appropriation right now because it hasn't been closed to revenue.
What would happen, John?
It
is
would have been
sit
free
there,
cash.
Would have been free cash.
But it sat in the ambulance account because that account was established back in 97, no,
91, maybe?
86, 87.
Oh.
And we just always went, oh, it's a rear account. We never read the specific language that says it goes X, Y, so we always carry that money over to state.
Okay.
That fund was June of '81.
No, it's sitting there.
81.
Yeah, it's sitting there.
June of
So
81.
it can be carried over and then appropriated the next year.
Yes.
Well, we have been, if we follow the language.
We should.
Warrant, we shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the residents approved that article
Right.
and the verbiage along with it.
So what John is now suggesting is we address it either by changing the rules for the account or identifying a different way to use that money.
And like I said, I totally get it and I understand it, but you also have to look at the fact that next year we're up to replace a 2010 ambulance and the year after we're up to replace a 2020 ambulance. I mean, 2012, so where's that money gonna come from in those 2 years?
But you have to put that in context. If you read John's summary, I mean, we're in the hole next year by $1 million.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the risks we take in doing this is we set ourselves up to fail to meet the expenditures that are necessary to maintain and support our capital needs. The capital plan is essential to addressing those needs. My belief is that no matter what we decide in this process, if we are going to have an effective capital plan, we're going to have to come up with an override that will provide funding for that plan. And then we have to make a commitment to continue to use that money for capital year after year, because as you know, when we do an override, the funds are only committed for year one. So we would, in conjunction with that, hopefully establish a policy that says every year we will increase our capital commitment by 2.5% using the money that was originally set for an override. So if it's $1 million, it's $1,025,000 next year. It's $1,050,250 the following year, and then we commit to that process, because if we don't, we're going to have no money and no equipment.
John, is one of the things in your report going to be a revenue forecast for 2021? And
Yes.
So you'll be able to look at our projected revenue just for next year or the next 5 years?
Yeah, you know, again, I mentioned it earlier in my report, the overall budget's been, on average, has been going up about 4.8%,
Right.
which, in my opinion, is unsustainable. I am putting in you could look at them as extremes. I think 4.8, almost 5% increase year over year is extreme. My recommendations are going to be about 2.25% for salaries and 2.5% for general expenses as far as the operating budget goes. Obviously, the debt is fixed and declining. Is with regard to education expenses are higher. It just is. It's called special ed. It really squeezes a budget, and my experience has been that the education budget increases usually run around 5%, which is built into the model that I have. And as was mentioned just a few minutes ago, if the town continues on the journey that it's been taking with its increases, and let's just say doesn't take any of my recommendations, and they're really good recommendations, into account, in FY21, you're going to need somewhere around $5 million to make ends meet. If you do take advantage of all of these really good ideas, and you can reel in the budget to a certain extent, you're looking at potentially FY22 before you need an override. One of the things that I did as part of the overall recommendation for these funds is to make them effective 7/1/20. So when you go into this town meeting in June of May, okay, well, it's not March. When you go into it in May, you're under the existing rules. And if you do choose to turn a blind eye and say carrying the ambulance balance forward is okay, then depending on when you need that next ambulance, if it's in 22 or if it's in 21, you reserve $200,000, transfer $150,000 of receipts in, and then at the next town meeting, buy your ambulance. There's a transition period. This is, I wouldn't say general, but the devil is in the details. And during that transition period, based on the recommendations, you are going to have to peel back the layers of the onion and take a look and say, but I need that ambulance and I planned on getting it in 21. Or in the case of the patrol cars, their lease goes through, I believe, 22. But there is that transition period that people have to sit down and say, okay, this is when I needed it, when. And that would happen in anything where you're changing a paradigm shift as to how you want to do things.
Just to note, we did vote in May to lease purchase 2 new vehicles. That lease purchase will occur in this fiscal year. So what we have to think about is what we're going to do in fiscal 21, which is a meeting we're going to have in 5 months.
And you still have 2 lease purchases on fire equipment.
And I built those into my model as far as additional costs, whether they're levy. Again, you've done some extraordinary things, I think. You've done what it's taken to make ends meet. I commend management and town meeting for moving the renovation and rehabilitation debt into excluded debt. What it did do, you would hope on the surface that, okay, so we have that much levy available. No, because we weren't funding debt with levy or with taxation. We were funding it with free cash and other available sources. What you can do once you fund your ongoing expenses with your ongoing revenues is free cash, which has averaged about $1 million for the last 5 years, and actually took a spike. Of course, I'm going to recommend that we take $500,000 of that. But you've generated what I would consider to be the foundation of any capital plan. If you can generate $1 million, $900,000 to $1 million for a community this size, you have to understand that just because everybody wants it in '21 doesn't mean they're going to get it. You prioritize, you determine that something can be pushed off to the next year, and you take that into consideration the next year. You don't just keep kicking the can down the road. But you've now freed up free cash as the foundation of your capital plan, and that's very important. And at the same time, you've taken the levy that you've used to supplement your capital plan and moved it back up into the operating budget where I feel it's better suited.
The only thing we have to remember is, as John said earlier, free cash is never guaranteed. And if we do some of the things we're talking about, we know that we're going to reduce our free cash by $500,000. So that has to be part of that planning process.
Mm-hmm.
John, question. What is your recommendation for technology for schools in regards to the capital or operating budget expense, specifically like laptops, technology? Would it be one or the other? Can you make that a capital expense for schools?
I don't see anything changing with regard to the capital plan. Those series of articles that come anywhere after your debt to adjournment of town meeting, I saw as basically a form of your capital plan, of which you have school items, you have regional school items. They're all part of the capital plan, and they would be funded accordingly. What we're looking at right now is anywhere in between a $5 million override in '21, and you would sock away the overage into a special purpose fund and release it as needed, and that'll carry you through at least 5 years, and $1 million in '22. Somewhere in between those two numbers. I mean, there are going to be situations where department's going to say, I'm sorry, but 2.25 for salaries and 2.5 for expenses doesn't work for me. So, those are variables that you have to take into consideration. But, I think that the trend indicates that if you keep going where you're going, it's going to be somewhere probably around $5 million. And if you treat the future as if John Madden ruled the world, it could potentially be as low as $1 million a year later, which gives you some time to work out some of the things that you're going through now. I also said my report wouldn't consider the ongoing negotiations with the allocation plan. But if you can hold off an override until the dust settles, one thing at a time. I'm very simplistic. I don't like juggling a lot of things in the air, one thing at a time. But that could change everything. That could change everything. I think a lot of the recommendation I make change the landscape. And when you get into '22, if you can hold off for that long, you can develop the funding sources for your capital plan. Maybe you only need $1 million, but it ain't 5, so let's go to 2 million. And now we have levy funding for the capital plan, in addition to free cash and other available funds. It may seem obvious by now, but I didn't touch the enterprise funds. First of all, they're not an issue. And what you're looking for is your operating budget. And the enterprise fund, one way or another, will contribute a substantial amount of money to the general fund. But the enterprise funds generally aren't part of the purview when you're looking at working in the general fund.
Well, and frankly, some of that money is already spoken for, as we'll talk about when we hold our December 2nd special town meeting. We know that we have huge expenses in that area. The other thing that I think we should remain aware of is our growth is limited. Without an override, we're looking at $1 million in revenue growth in '21. That's it. All of our increased costs.
Well, there's a bonus that comes with it, is when you increase your base levy, you increase your 2.5 increase.
But
So-
our new growth was $95,000 less than last year.
Yeah, it was $248,000, I believe.
That kind of boggles my mind. The 3-year average that you have, we were 42,000, that didn't include the year where we had the real high national.
No, that's
That was out of-
clearly an anomaly.
So that's a pretty accurate average then that we were below. So the question I have is, with all the building that's going on now, where is that and when is that going to hit? That's got to hit eventually.
We'll see a significant part of that next year in the '21 assessments, because those projects are ongoing now. My guess is they're going to be about 80 or 90 housing units that will be completed before we begin to assess FY '21 growth. So you'll see that.
So how do we get a better handle on that so that we can have a better revenue estimate on what that could be? Because that hurt us a lot this year. We went in with the same as last year, 340, which based on the averages that I had run, I thought that was about $50,000 high, and we ended up coming in even less than that.
Well, part of that is because a significant number of those new projects had delayed starts.
Yeah.
They weren't started. They were permitted, but they weren't started. And until they're in place, we don't see them as revenue, and we see them in the fiscal year following.
So now back to the inspectional services, and is there a way that we can help him get a better communication system or a better, right now he's a part-time guy working hard. Is there some type of automated system or software that we can get in?
No, that won't change what happened. What happened is we issued permits, but they didn't build.
All right.
Software isn't going to change that. That's where we're seeing a lull.
So it's basically,
or
what
lag
happened
in the
was,
value.
we saw a lot of stuff, but it got delayed, so it didn't really,
So it
those
didn't
numbers
hit
are.
it didn't hit our revenue.
Well, you had the national grid.
And also, don't expect a pop due to new growth. I mean,
No.
as it goes along, every June 30th is your cutoff
Makes sense.
for building progress. So if a building is 70% complete as of June 30th, okay, the following June 30th, you don't get a full 100%, you get 30%. So you have to remember that. It doesn't go from 0 to 60 in 3.1 seconds.
But I guess my question is, did we really get that 7?
Well, that's I don't want to call anybody on the carpet, but if you want to have Patriot Properties come in and discuss what their process is, because I'm not aware, I've never used them as an outside source, so I don't know. But you just said what I've heard a lot of. There's a lot of growth going on around here. Where is it? You have to go to the source there. But it is lower than anticipated. It's lower than it was anticipated at the beginning of the budget process, which brings us back to the margin of error with regard to your local receipts. Okay, if you estimated $400,000 in new growth, okay, and you go to town meeting and you build your budget on $400,000 worth of new growth, and it only comes in at $300,000, well, guess what? You still have a budget to balance. So you revisit your estimated receipts, which you've estimated 85% of the prior full year's collection, and say, okay, we get a little wiggle room in here. We can bump up this a little, we can bump up that a little bit, with a level of confidence. That's why it's important to have that buffer, because municipal budgeting is such a wonderful process. You start talking about it in your case, let's say August, September of 19, You go to town meeting in May of '20, you get your real numbers in November of '20. Okay, 5 or 6 months after town meeting is closed, you finally get to know what your real numbers are with regard to your tax levy. And all the while, you're trying to figure out how much you're going to spend as of June of 2021. And truthfully, I love it. I just do.
Frank, what would a $5 million override, what would be the annual increase of an average house in Whitman for taxes?
If you gave me a minute to crank up my computer, I could get that for you.
Frank's got a computer in his head.
Those are the things I'm very hesitant to respond to, because someone is going to remember us.
Yeah. It'll be all over social media.
Oh, yeah, there are a lot of qualifiers in it, there's no question. But it would also be based on the current tax rate, because that's what you know you have.
Dave, our ballpark in the FinCom last year was a $2.4 million override. I don't remember what the average increase was, though.
I think
4 or
that's an
5
important number
yeah.
to have, for this committee to recommend an override or not. But while Frank's looking that up, I also think that it's irresponsible for this committee to recommend an override without taking into all, some if not all, of the cost-saving recommendations that John Madden has presented with us. And you know, I don't mean to be argumentative, Chief, but to sit there and advocate for an override without at all considering better practices is completely irresponsible in my mind. You know, it being on the Finance Committee, we've had a few department heads come in and meet, and there is one department who's advocating for a 15% increase of their department. Again, you know, the Finance Committee has been banging on the door of the Board of Selectmen for years now, saying that it's just not sustainable. And here we are again in a different committee with an expert of John Madden, with his experience coming from outside the town in, telling everybody here it's not sustainable, that things have to change. Well, things have to change, and department heads should be prepared to do that. And if not, you know, that's going to lie on the pocketbooks of every taxpayer in here, in this town, and it's just not fair. I don't think it's right, and just to throw money at a situation without considering and implementing every option that's out there before so.
Just for clarification, I don't disagree with what John's saying. What I'm saying is that my concern is that if we move that money and use it the way that is being suggested, and it goes away, it's going to create a bigger problem than what we're facing right now.
It's fine.
You can use the animal revenue account to buy police cruisers if you need to. It's just, my opinion is that moving that money out and using it for salaries or wherever else it wants to go, if all of a sudden it goes away in 6 months, I think it's a lot easier to deal with it where it is now versus it being part of the overall budget. You can use it for any capital project that you want to use it for.
Can we though? Can we use it for non-fire capital?
I believe so.
According to the 1981 article we
Well,
can.
we haven't been.
We haven't.
We haven't, and I think the recommendation is actually to tighten the language up to make a certain amount of that
Yeah.
specific only to fire, right? And then another amount able to be carried over. So I guess I'm not opposed to the change. I have had, 15 minutes to weigh it, so I guess I would commit either way. And Dave, I guess I agree a lot with what you're saying regarding, I think we have to look at the tightening of any controls and ensure that we have best practices in place before we recommend an override. I don't know if it would be included in the report. I think it's fair to look at, when you talk about the increase per tax bill, but what are the median tax bills of the towns around us?
For the median.
Compared to us, right? And where do we fall and how we break that pie up?
Well, sure, we talk median, there's only a few people in that sweet spot. Randy, you're on the other side of it.
Unfortunately.
So, for the median house, it's $193 per $1 million per year.
183. 193.
Per million on the
So
override.
5 million is 193 times 5.
Yes.
It's about $963.
$900
Per year.
John,
per year.
That's going to go
if I can
Yeah.
pipe in, because I think a lot of people are going to be, right now or at home, calling realtors ready to sell.
Certainly the ones watching.
What prevents us from being back in this spot 5 years from now? And I think this is the thing I wrestle with constantly in this process, is we are trying to produce a sustainable budget, and not something where we say, give us $5 million now, and in 5 years, we're coming back for $5 more million. I think there's some projects, too, that probably you haven't quite taken into consideration, because they're kind of on the back burner, but we're probably talking at least another $2 million of projects between school and DPW.
Oh, there's actually more than that. In meeting with the building commissioner, you also have, I think it's the senior center that's in the queue. If you continue spending the way you are, okay, you'll be back in 5 years. You will. Unless you want to go $6 million, and then maybe you won't. It appears that, again, somewhere in the middle, but $1 million would get you beyond the scope that I studied, but a couple more years after that. But like you said, what you're looking at is a general override. When you start to get involved in, let's say you needed the pumping engine, ladder truck, something that's bigger than a bread box, you would either borrow over the course of 5 years as departmental equipment, or you would do a capital exclusion and ask the town to pay, which you've done before,
We did that.
15 or 16, somewhere in there.
Technology for the schools.
Okay. You take the hit in 1 year, and it goes back. The thing with a capital exclusion and a debt exclusion is, once the purpose for which the article was approved by the voters, you can no longer use that money to tax. It comes off the books. It's not like a general override where it stays forever. Whether it's a capital override of 1 year or a debt override of 20 years, as that money comes off your debt payments, it can't be bled up into your operating budget. It is, that's why I think I've had a couple of conversations with members that when you're calculating your tax levy, right in the middle of it is a hard stop. And it's like, okay, so you've taken last year and you put in your 2.5 and you've done your new growth. This is the most you can raise by law. This is your 2.5. But wait a minute, after that, if the voters agree, then you can add your debt service for that particular year out to the end of the life of the debt. And it goes away. Most municipal bonding works as level principal and declining interest. So each year, it's not like a mortgage that you would have if you were just paying P&I. It doesn't stay the same amount for the life of the mortgage. It's a declining debt service. Principal, for the most part, always stays the same. So you have $1 million over 10 years, your principal is always going to be $100,000. But the first year, your interest is going to be on $1 million. In the second year, it's going to be on $900,000. hence the declining interest payment year after year. So it always goes lower. One of the things that you can't do it yet. There's you have a lot of opportunities here. The fact that you created this committee shows that you can provide opportunities. But if you have debt within the levy, again, as a financial policy, so you started out with $1 million and $300,000 worth of interest. So the next year, it goes, $100,000 and $275,000 in interest. Don't touch the $25,000. Reserve it for capital or future debt. So
Right.
what happens is,
Only inside the.
yeah, exactly. It's inside the levy.
Let me ask you this. If we did a $1.2 million capital override, well, we already know that the operating costs for the budget next year in '21, we're $1.5 million short, so that capital money now is just going to get eaten up into the operating budget 1 year later, correct?
No, you can't raise it.
What's that?
You can't raise it. Remember, you got that hard stop in the middle of your levy calculation?
Right.
So you've got, and I won't be able to keep track of all these numbers, I'm just not that smart. You've got a base of $30 million in your levy. And 2.5% of that, I don't know, but now you're up $1 million. And your new growth, let's say $200,000. So if I started with 30,000, now I'm at 31,250. That amount of money can be used in all of our natural lives, okay? After that hard stop, there is your excluded debt that's above that 31,250. That amount is going to reduce year after year, all things considered, if you're not doing any future borrowing. That amount is going to reduce year after year. But as it reduces, it can't go up above that hard stop.
What
Okay.
I think what Rand is referring to is debt within the levy.
Mhm.
We borrow $1 million.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Or we raise $1 million in levy. In year one, that's capital money. It's going to be committed to paying capital debt.
But we already,
Year two,
we know there's a shortfall, and now,
town meeting says, hey, we want to use that money for the budget.
you're going to have to,
We're
because
between a rock and a hard place because we now have debt with the service.
Well, you know what,
We have to pay it.
you're absolutely right. It can be used for salaries, it can be used for electricity, it can be used for anything. That's where it comes down to discipline, and that's where it comes down to policies. You've set your capital within the levy at $1.3 million, and that line is going to stay $1.3 million. Let's say forever, okay? Are you using $1.3 million year after year? No, because what's happening is those interest payments are getting less and less, but you set your ceiling at $1.3 million. So while it doesn't sound like $25,000 is a lot, a couple of years later, now you've got, $55,000, whatever. You can use it to buy a truck, okay? Why does it lend itself? Remember, levy, ongoing expenses, but you've segregated this levy for one-time expenses. So the beauty of it is you buy that truck for $55,000. It's done. Next year, that $55,000 comes back on the rolls, and you can use it to buy another truck. But it's discipline and it's policy, and those are a couple of weak areas. And but like I said, I think you can get past that.
I think what would enable that is we identify how much money we're going to spend. When we find that the amount of debt service drops, that difference should be appropriated into a debt reserve account. It should not reduce your levy, because you're going to maintain that amount of money, and then 2 years later, that money's still available for appropriation. You've disciplined yourself to spend $1.3 million a year on capital. If you only have to spend $1 million this year, the 300 goes in reserve because you're going to spend it next year.
And you already have a capital stabilization fund. That would be an option.
But if we have a shortfall that you've diagnosed in the operating budget, so we may be able to get through this year, but let's say we did a capital override. Now, the purpose of that is to establish a capital plan, I would think. That's how you would
You
say.
talking about a capital override or an
Yes.
override for capital?
An override
Is the difference
an override
is
for
that they'll
capital.
say
Right.
a capital override is only one.
Right, an override for capital,
capital.
where we are going to try and finance the Collins Center report. The way they listed it out, to a point.
Frank came up with a great idea, because the law doesn't prevent you from taking levy that was once appropriated for debt. And once that liability is exhausted, to pay for electricity and salaries. There's nothing in the law that stops you from doing that. Frank's idea is a good one, in that if you only use $1 million out of 300 and you want to make sure that you hold fast to what the original plan was, you appropriate that difference. It might be the last article in your capital plan
And that's
every year.
typically what we've done.
Okay.
Did you look into what exactly we were short? If we did not use any one-time budget for recurring operating expenses this coming year, how much we were short?
You mean what your shortfall for '21 will be?
Yes.
About 1.7 million. Again, if you use the 5-year trends, okay, if you go status quo, if you do things the way you've been doing them for the last 5 years, about 1.7 million.
Randy, I think what you're saying a little bit too is, right, if we don't fix the operating budget,
Right.
then we might as well throw the capital plan out the window, because as disciplined as you want to be, when you're faced, people versus buying a truck, you're going to try to keep the people,
Right.
right? I mean, it's what's going to happen.
That's kind of what I was getting to. We can ask for we can make a well-intentioned effort to try and get on this capital plan, but
You need to do both at the same time.
we already know we're $1 million plus short. So you're going to take that money and you're not going to lose people.
And
You're not gonna
and
say
I don't mean to
capital.
be cavalier about it, because it's your money, not mine, but if you're going to have to do an override for $1 million, maybe you want to do an override for $2 million, recognizing that the purpose for $1 million of that was dedicated to capital. But you have to be disciplined. And 4.8% increases overall doesn't indicate discipline.
Right, and the issue is sustainability. Whatever we decide to do as a community has to be framed from an understanding of what our ability to grow revenue is. Because if we allow costs to increase above and beyond our ability to generate revenue, we're either going in overrides or we're dipping into money that was reserved for another purpose, and before long you're out of both. And that happened a couple of years ago.
I think one other thing we need to recognize is that with the National Grid assessment, with that assessment devaluing over time, the people's taxes are going to increase. So any override is going to be twofold, because our taxes are increasing as National Grid depreciates. Now you're putting on top of that an override. So when we talk about an override, we can't just think of it independently of that, but also in context of our taxes for real estate increasing.
Do we actually know what the depreciation of the National Grid equipment is?
It's running at the rate of between 20 and 30 million a year. It'll be gone in 4 years.
And people should think of that, right? it was a bit of an influx of cash, and it does nothing but kind of kick the can down the road, right? We know that it was a very limited timeframe.
We used that money for capital.
Right.
We didn't put it in the budget.
Right.
But ultimately,
But this is why you
because
need
it's part
recurring
of
money.
the total levy, it works its way into the budget because we're working off that top number.
But we also left a lot of it on the table that year. We had a $1.4 million excess levy or unspent levy, as Mr. Madden likes to talk.
But we spent $1 million of it the next year.
We still had 700,000 excess
Yeah.
levy the next year. So, I mean, you know, one of the things that I asked earlier, and I didn't really get the question answered, at least in my mind, is your report going to have a revenue forecast on, because yes, we know what the tax levy is going to be and we can estimate what the growth is going to be, but what we don't know is that what was around $16 million this year in local receipts and all the other, and at one point indirect costs were in there and then they weren't, and do we have an estimate on that? Because, you know, if we're putting together a budget, if we don't know what the total amount of money we have to spend is, how do we actually create an expenditure budget if we don't know how much we have to spend?
Well, that's where it all starts.
The last
That's
year
where
or
it all
so that I've
starts.
been involved in trying to go to finance committees, and I haven't seen that we have an accurate revenue forecast on, yeah, we know what the tax levy is going to be, but we don't know what that in between that 16 million is going to be and what the forecast is for that. And without knowing that, how do we put together an actual budget if we don't know how much we have to spend? And that's one of the things I'd like to see us work on, and hopefully we'll get that forecast from you. I don't know if you have just a 21 revenue forecast or a 5-year.
No, it's 5-year, but it doesn't take into account levy shifts, which is what you're getting at. You have residential, open space, commercial, but you are, but in a way you are, because you have bills to pay, and they're not going down. So when you look at that, you increase your levy based on what you know. Because here's what's going to happen. If there's depreciation in personal property, which I believe is what the utility is, okay, it's just going to be a shift. It's going to go to the residential. It's going to go to the residential side of the tax recap. And
Well, that's what he was saying, yeah.
If you continue to appropriate it.
Yeah.
Because we've only really used it for capital expenditures.
But we used it. It was part of what we left.
So you have,
and it's in your base.
That's now part of your base.
yeah.
So what's happening now is if we never gain another dollar in income, we never spend another dollar in expense, that number's going to stay the same, but it's going to shift to the rest and the commercial tax.
And as far as getting down in the weeds, no, that's not something. I base the trends on the town's tax recap. But at least you're thinking that way, because a lot of times they say, well, our town has the highest tax rate around. Tax rate's important, but in many ways it's irrelevant. You've got 3 components. You've got the value of your home, you've got the tax rate, okay, and you have the levy. And so what happens is, if, as Frank said, you weren't going to spend another dollar, all things were considered level, but the value of everybody's house goes up, tax rate goes down. You're still paying the same amount of money, but your house gained more value. And so the calculation, like I use distance equals rate times time. Well, your tax bill is the distance, and you've got a tax rate, okay, and you've got the value of your home. There's your rate times time. And that's where you're at. And it also, in a rising market, community's always a year behind. So in a rising market, you're paying less than market value for your house, because remember, the values are calculated on sales. On a declining market, well, that's a different story. Because we're a year behind, you're paying a little bit more. Yeah. But it's sales-based. And the process, like I said, it's just a year behind.
John, I had a question for you about the sort of the other revenues. So the ambulance account and the motor vehicle fund account made sense to me. We already use that money for capital salaries.
Correct.
But using sewer, water, enterprise indirect costs, is that money that we're not already using toward Article 2? Would that be?
No, you're not. You're using it in capital because it goes into, because you don't use it as an instrument to balance the budget, it's found money. Found money is free cash. And so it has been a source of your free cash, depending on what the indirect costs were.
So we couldn't use that because we didn't allocate it at town meeting to use it as from free cash? Or we would have to take that amount and know it's in our free cash in order to allocate it to use for our budget, even though it's in free
Right.
cash.
The challenge has been the Department of Revenue has not allowed us to count that as revenue because technically we're double counting it.
Right.
Yeah, that's something you're going to have to correct going
That's
forward.
something we'll have to work out with the DOR.
Yeah.
Because you're appropriating.
And we'll work diligently.
So let's say you're paying the treasurer collector's office salaries, okay? And let's say 100% of that budget is $200,000. So you appropriate $200,000 in the general fund, right? Well, you determine that 25% of the treasurer collector's time is dedicated to services on behalf of the enterprise fund. So they're appropriating $50,000. You're only spending $1, but you've appropriated $2. What you need to get away from is appropriating, an article would sound something like, town votes to raise $5 million for water enterprise operations, and to meet such appropriation, raise $3 million to $5 million from water revenue, and further raise the amount of to transfer to the general fund, because that's where it's being appropriated. It's not being appropriated, it's being transferred from available funds. Conversely, over in the general fund, it would say we are raising we're appropriating $33 million for the town's operating budget, and to meet said appropriation, raise, that's the term for taxation,
32.
yeah, 32.5, and further transfer from the enterprise fund that $500,000.
So what would happen is it would disappear from the expenditure section of Article 2 in the enterprise where it says indirect costs. That line would be gone.
And at the minimum, just like we talked about the article language for those other funds, you got to clean that up at the minimum. You need to clean up the language because truthfully, between the two funds, you're appropriating $2 for $1 of expense, and you don't want to do that. So at a minimum, it would be worth cleaning that up. Whether you determine at the end of the day that you want it for free cash or to offset the levy, that's your call.
Anybody else? Then just on schooling, what were you figuring percentage-wise for when you did your 5-year?
5%. For recommended. But again, you've got a lot going on.
That's overall budget increase at 5%, is that what?
Yeah.
The town's assessment.
For the school department. For the other departments, it was, because the information that I have from previous budgets doesn't break out salaries and other expenses. But their entire budget was going up X amount each year. So stick with that, because it is a conglomeration of expenses and salaries. So somewhere in there, it was 6.5% or so. Like I said, I brought my computer, I brought my notebooks, I did not bring my crystal ball, so where the school allocation formula is going,
I just want to know what you use, and probably people on the, just making sure what we use for track.
Yeah, and again, my experience, and Obviously, Jeff has a lot more experience in this than I do. Special ed and unfunded mandates are a killer. There's no question about it. And I know that we used to refer to it as the special ed stork. They can drop a $200,000 baby in your lap on any given day. They liked Whitman. They bought a house. One of their children, unfortunately, was special needs. You don't anticipate it. I don't know for sure. Some school districts might anticipate a couple of special needs additions. Some might not have that flexibility. But it is something that you just, certainly special ed, your budgets are going up at a gradual increase, but they're not matching the steep incline in special ed. And throw in a couple of unfunded mandates here and there. It's a much more difficult budget to deal with because of the unknowns. Not so much like the regular operating budget, because over the years you kind of have a sense of what your salary is going to be, what your utilities are going to be, what your expenses are going to be. Schools don't always have that benefit. But I wasn't going to give away the farm either, so we went with 5%.
I think I'd want to comment on that before we go. A 5% assessment increase to the town of Whitman. In perspective, for this past budget, FY20, it was an 8.5% assessment increase, and we know what that resulted in, loss of staff. So my first impression is a 5% assessment increase would be another loss of staff. I don't know.
Can I clarify, is that a 5% increase in the overall budget, or?
No,
In the overall budget, because like I said, I don't have that type of breakdown.
He's using 5% for the budget.
Yeah.
So just to be clear.
Just for what the assessment was, a 5% increase in the overall assessment of the Whitman-Hanson Regional School District. This does not include the Aggies or any of those other school assessments that you have. And again,
include their total budget, it's our assessment.
No.
It's not
Right.
the total school budget.
5% above what you paid last year.
Right.
Yeah. Or that you're going to pay this year. And again,
That's right.
some may say,
Happy with a 5% budget.
Oh, I would, because I got 3.5.
But that's something
What
we're
I'm
talking about.
hearing.
well, that's something too that we talked about when we met, is the school's regional school budget is going up about 3 to 3.5%.
Right.
But the assessment, I think, and it has to do with the allocation, but I don't know, is causing the assessment to go up at a greater rate than the school's budget.
Assessment and stagnant Chapter 70 money. We go up 100,000 a year and 24 million, that's
Yeah.
a rounding error.
Whitman pays about 30% of the cost of the schools right under the current assessment and eats 60% of the increase. That's what-
And again, this aspect of it is based on experience. It's not anything that's carved in stone. There are some comparable school districts that did come in at 2.5, but it's not a regional school district, so maybe it's apples and oranges, I don't know. But I know that school districts struggle with their unknowns all over, no question about that. And if 5% doesn't work, and it's going to be 6% or 7% increase in the assessment, then you'll have to adjust your override accordingly. If a department comes in and says, nah, I can't do 2.5% in expenses, and everyone is in agreement with that, then you're going to have to consider that when you look for an override. The numbers I've recommended aren't wrong and they're not right, but they're just based on experience. But each community is different. Their needs are different.
Anybody else? All right, so like Mr. Madden said, he will have a finalized report Thursday. It'll go out to the board members Thursday night or at the latest Friday morning. We'll review it, and the last meeting will be the time to really formulate some questions that we're going to base this decision on. So I would ask everyone to take the time, look through it, especially the department heads we have on the board. I mean, this is potentially the future of the town we're talking about for the next 5 years, so I would hope everyone does due diligence in that. We're going to shoot for December 2nd, 5 o'clock. Did you want to say something? Okay. December 2nd, 5 o'clock, that's before a special town meeting. And we'll be wrapping up then, basically. Anything else?
No, I guess maybe just to consider what that wrap-up is going to be. So are we going to look to vote for some recommendations from this committee to give to Board of Selectmen?
Well, not a committee wrap-up, but I think at that point, you would be done, right, John?
Yeah, then basically it's up to Finance Committee and
So it's kind of, December 2nd is the last chance to kind of ask John
Right.
additional
To
questions and
finalize with him, and then, I know we had talked early on, but probably the first of the year is when we'd be trying to come to some type of conclusion here. So I was thinking maybe we'll shoot for December 2nd, then we'll try to get one more meeting in before Christmas, and maybe that meeting is when we'll take it to the recommendation stage, and then immediately following the first of the year, we'll know where we're at.
So if there are any questions or comments that you haven't visited based on this report,
Right.
that's what we need to know.
I will say that I plan on having the final. I figured, Randy, I'd send it to you, and you could disseminate it among the committee. If anybody has any questions on, what were you thinking when you recommended this, I can support my recommendations or the numbers, anything like that. But I'd like to think that what you have for me on Thursday, it's a wrap. But I'm not, like I said, I told Frank, I'm not going anywhere. We can ask questions. Again, Tim, we talked about the transition.
I should also note you talked about possibly reviewing the financial policies and taking advantage of John's expertise in fine-tuning.
You probably wrote some of them. I said, I think you wrote some of them.
Yeah, a few of them.
Well, I think if there's one thing I can take out of this is, obviously, we realize we're in a shortfall, but I think going forward, we need a systematic change through the whole process. If we're going to opt for sustainability, the last thing I'm going to do is ask the taxpayers for more money if the same thing is just going to keep recurring. We all pay our tax bill, and it's unfair. So unless we can, be confident we're going to fix this problem, then I'm going to have a hard time myself asking people for more money. All set? Thank you, Mr. Madden.
Thank you.
That's it?
Unless you got any more, John? All right, motion
Listen,
to
you guys
adjourn.
asked some great questions tonight. I really appreciate it. They're very thoughtful. You've given us some time, so thanks.